Western economic sanctions on Russia were meant to destroy the Russian economy and currency, but has the collective West miscalculated and now face a changing reality where there is an increased pace in de-dollarization. The sanctions that have been imposed on Russia thus far are trying to limit Russia's access to money. The U.S. has barred Russia from making debt payments using foreign currency held in U.S. banks. Major Russian banks have been removed from the international financial messaging system SWIFT. This has delayed payments to Russia for its oil and gas exports. The UK has excluded key Russian banks from the UK financial system, frozen the assets of all Russian banks, barred Russian firms from borrowing money, and placed limits on deposits Russians can make at UK banks. The European Union will ban imports of Russian oil brought in by sea from December. The EU will ban all imports of refined oil products from Russia in February 2023. The US is banning all Russian oil and gas imports. The UK will phase out Russian oil by the end of 2022. It no longer imports Russian gas. Germany has frozen plans for the opening of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia. The EU has stopped importing Russian coal, and from December, the EU and G7 also want to cap the price countries pay for Russian oil. They are telling importers of Russian crude oil that Western insurers will not cover oil shipments if they pay more than the cap. The US, EU, UK, and other countries have sanctioned more than 1,000 Russian individuals and businesses, including so-called oligarchs. These are wealthy business leaders who are thought to be close to the Kremlin, such as former Chelsea FC owner Roman Abramovich. Western sanctions have signaled to the rest of the world that non-Western countries are at risk of losing their assets to Western nations. The West, in particular the US, has long benefited from its ability to issue safe assets to the rest of the world, but the belief that Western nations were a safe haven for assets is quickly changing. US and EU credibility in the economic world was undermined by its decision to freeze Russian assets via unilateral sanctions. Freezing the assets has been enough to make people lose trust in the country. This adds to the evidence that the US and EU are no longer a safe place to store reserves. The US has global financial hegemony, but such hegemony is two-way. The US needs to provide services to the world and depends on the world's support. The US abuses its position to use sanctions as a geopolitical tool against rivals. It will be the death knell for its financial hegemony. Sanctions on Russia's financial system, such as the freezing of the central bank's reserves, will probably become a turning point for US financial hegemony. A large portion of US Treasury bonds are foreign-owned. As more countries reduce their holdings of US Treasury bonds, it's understandable that Yellen wants to alleviate tensions caused by a collapse in the US reputation. But her efforts are doomed to fail. With unilateral sanctions, the US and EU are bringing the world back to the era of a lawless jungle. Now, more people are worried about the security of their assets in the US and EU. The G7 plan to put a price cap on Russian crude is at odds with free market principles. The European Union is capping the price of gas, and the G7 group is trying to cap the price of exported Russian oil. Both amount to direct market intervention. The plan is to limit the price paid for Russian oil, but at a level that would still be profitable enough for production to be continued. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said it in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. The Kremlin said that Russia would stop selling oil to countries that impose price caps on Russia's energy resources. These caps could lead to significant destabilization of the global oil market. Russia will continue to be able to ship most of its oil to customers after the G7 price cap mechanism comes into force on December 5th, saying the country has access to enough tankers and services, its own as well as those in Asia, to continue trade. The sanctions are also backfiring. Businesses across Europe are not just curbing their energy use and continuing on a business-as-usual basis. They are shutting down factories, downsizing, or relocating. Europe may well be on the way to de-industrialization. The Eurozone manufacturing activity has fallen to the lowest since May 2020. The October reading for global's PMI signaled a looming recession, falling in November and being the fourth monthly reading below 50, which is an indication of an economic contraction. A look at the IEA report shows that the European Union is going to face a great challenge in meeting its energy needs in the coming years and considering the heavy costs of shipping gas from long distances. Liquefied natural gas exports from the U.S. are enriching the U.S. liquefied natural gas industry. However, concerns about the high cost of U.S. liquefied natural gas from within the EU are starting to become more apparent. Senior officials of the EU's two biggest powers, France and Germany, have accused the U.S. of overcharging for liquefied natural gas and using the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis to turn a profit and make Europe dependent on its gas. The U.S. has been criticized by French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire and German Economy Minister Robert Habeck. Le Maire recently told French MPs that the conflict in Ukraine must not result in the U.S. economic domination and a weakened Europe. The U.S. should not be allowed to dominate the global energy market as the EU suffers the consequences of the conflict in Ukraine, said Le Maire. He also said it is unacceptable to let the U.S. export liquefied natural gas at prices 4 times higher than those paid by companies in the country. The French minister also called for establishing a more balanced relationship between the U.S. and Europe. Protests have taken place across the European Union in response to surging prices and increased living costs caused by Russia's sanctions. Thousands of protesters marched through the streets of some of the EU's main capital cities, urging authorities to take action and abolish Russian sanctions. The Netherlands has decided to withdraw sanctions against Russia without permission from the European Union. The Dutch Ministries of Foreign Affairs, Economic Affairs, Finance, Infrastructure, and Education have the option of granting exemptions. According to a report, the Dutch ministries have granted a total of 91 exemptions from sanctions against Russia. Protesters marched through Berlin to express their displeasure with the government's policies on skyrocketing energy prices, crushing living expenses, and inadequate social policies, pushing their government to relax restrictions on Russian oil and gas supply. As sanctions fatigue sets in, fractures amongst Western nations might become more apparent and the non-Western world loses its trust in the West. While the United States and its closest allies in Europe and Asia have imposed tough economic sanctions on Moscow, 87% of the world's population has declined to follow. Some experts concluded that Western sanctions have accomplished distrust in the collective West. The West has also set a precedent to the rest of the world that the free markets they have promoted to the world come with a catch. The West can use price controls and market manipulation for strategic, economic, and political advantage. U.S. Treasury officials have also expressed concerns about setting precedents and eroding other countries' confidence in holding their central bank assets in the United States. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen stated concerning freezing Russian state assets in May, "It is not something that is legally permissible in the United States." Other experts have expounded on these concerns, including stating that we have undermined trust in the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, preventing the euro from ever challenging the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. We have reduced the creditworthiness of Western central banks. We have incentivized China, Russia, Iran, and other nations to bypass Western financial infrastructure. We have encouraged developing nations to join non-Western economic blocs such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we have transformed fully decentralized currencies such as Bitcoin into respectable alternative transaction currencies. Michael Hartnett, an analyst from Bank of America, sums it up quite well with his warning. U.S. dollar debasement is the ultimate outcome from an increasingly weaponized era of sanctions.